Let's get this ball rolling.
All right. The League.
Game.
Philosophers.
Unscripted.
Unedited.
Video game podcast.
For you.
To enjoy. So how are you, Chris?
I am mighty fine. Mighty fine.
Excellent.
Yeah. I quit my job a couple of months ago and have been diving into game development in the meantime. Most of my days are filled with watching tutorials and studying code. And yeah, one of the first things I did when I quit my job was to essentially give myself the clean slate, the palate cleanser of a gaming experience. And I knew I wanted to jump into something nostalgic. And I had a version of Final Fantasy VI that was on my Mister, and you told me about a translation for it.
Yeah.
In particular. So I had a little bit of fun setting that up and getting that going. And before I knew it, I ended up playing through the entire game. Yeah.
As it happens.
Yeah. Yeah. How about you? How are you doing? When's the last time you played Final Fantasy VI?
Well, actually, I quit my job a month ago. But then I got another job in the same field doing more and getting paid better. So
nice.
Final Fantasy VI, I got the Final Fantasy VI Pixel Remaster. So I was just curious. And I was like, nah, I played through this a couple years ago. That was my most recent playthrough. I used to only play through it like maybe once every 5 years or so, but I played through the entire thing. I didn't beat it. I am like right at the end. I got a couple more things to do if I really want to, but I played through the game dozens of times over my life. I really don't need to do that. But I ended up getting right towards the end, and overpowered as I am, I could beat the game right now if I wanted to.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's been great. I have a lot to say about the Pixel Remaster.
And on top of that, I know that you created a new save in Final Fantasy 15 and actually put a chunk of time into that too,
like
didn't you?
15 hours.
Yeah. Nice. And this is a game that you've already played through and beat at least
three times.
Three times. Damn. Which is interesting too, because outside of 6 and 15, there's not many Final Fantasies that you've actually played through and beat that many times, is there?
I've played through 4 a few times. I played through 4 on the Super NES, the DS remake, the GBA remake, and the PSP version. The PSP version of Final Fantasy IV is my favorite. So I played through that 4 times.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, actually 5. I played through the PSP version twice. It's fantastic. Wow. I played through Final Fantasy 12 once, and then the Zodiac Age version I played a little over halfway through that.
Yeah.
Actually maybe a little bit longer, because it has the speed up option that like the modern Final Fantasy remake stuff does. So you as you're grinding, it takes like a quarter of the time that it used to. So actually, honestly, the 24 hours I put in that, I'm probably 70% through the game, come to think of it, where I am in the story.
Yeah. Interesting to be playing both of those kind of at the same time, because they play so vastly different. But especially 15 and 6, once you started mentioning some of like the overlap in the storylines and how similar they are in a lot of ways, like the prince and the royalty and where it's going and whatnot, it actually almost makes like a nice companion game.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, I've heard a lot of people have problems with 15 because they're like, well, it's not a traditional Final Fantasy. And then I come back, well, what the fuck's a traditional Final Fantasy? Like, they're all a little different, everyone tries different gameplay things. Everyone tries something a little bit different. You have some like themes and motifs that tie them all together, but every Final Fantasy game is its own unique entity, right? So that, I mean, I kind of get what they're saying, because it's like, oh, it's another open world game. But then these people are like, but I played Assassin's Creed Odyssey and it was the greatest thing on the planet. And I'm just like, it is a game full of shit bloat, like every Ubisoft open world game. So
yeah, not all open world's the same.
Right, exactly. 15 strikes me very, very different, because at the very beginning of the game, you have 4 characters that are constantly interacting and talking with each other. So you don't just have the perspective of you and your avatar in the world. You constantly have the perspective of your 3 best friends commenting on you and your place in the world to give you more context, I guess. You don't
Yeah.
have to spend time building that party. You don't have to spend time getting to know those people as a main character. Like, you all already have that familiarity, so they're all already talking to you and quipping with you and things like that in ways that you usually have to build up to in other RPGs with huge stories,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
cool. I really like that aspect about it. And one of the jokes that I always make whenever I sit down to play is I'll tell my partner, I'm like, all right, I'm going on the road trip with the boys, I'll see you in a bit. Because it feels like you're just traveling around with, a group of your best friends, shooting the shit, killing monsters, doing fantasy things,
Yeah. Occasionally
saving the
shooting some
world.
lightning. Yeah.
I mean, but it's a whole lot of fun. No character is exceedingly whiny. Like, even Prompto is endearing in his own way. I actually really ended up liking Prompto throughout it, but yeah, there's a lot of Final Fantasy that's injected into it, and especially like parallels with 6. You get to the World of Ruin in 6, and it becomes an open world game. You can
Yep.
go and you can do anything. Like, it is truly open world. You don't have any direction. It's kind of like Elden Ring or Breath of the Wild in that respect, right?
Mhm.
There's a couple things you need to do, but probably 75% of the things you can do in the World of Ruin, you don't have to.
Right.
And I love that. It's kind of a proto open world game before open world was open world. It is a very non-linear adventure. And while Final Fantasy 15 certainly has a, dotted line to the story you can follow and make it feel a little bit more like a traditional Final Fantasy game if you want to. If not, there's plenty of stuff to just walk off the beaten path and find to do. That's, some of it's interesting, some of it's not. You can engage with the non-interesting stuff if you don't want to. It's not going to impact you much, because you don't need to do all of the ancillary stuff in order to actually have your levels be where they need to be in order to progress in the story.
Yeah. And that's something
So
I
it's
think
totally optional.
we're going to see more and more of that, where a lot of games are going to be trying to straddle both. Like, there's almost a sense that like any games coming out these days need to be open world, that games almost need to deliver on this like technical promise of being bigger, greater, and more majestic than the last. And that comes with having a giant, open world that can be explored.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting because we obviously as a whole got super stuck on open world for a long time, and that's all that was churned out. And they quickly started to show their frayed edges, and you started seeing where a lot of content wasn't being crafted. It was just kind of being generated. Everything felt kind of bloated, and you can only do so much of that before all of a sudden you're not invested in the world itself, and it no longer matters how big, how open it is, because you're kind of checked out, because the world itself has nothing to say. And then on the flip side, you have like the very crafted, straightforward approach to things, and you sacrifice all of the creative and innovative emergent moments that could possibly happen as things interact with each other. And you get that sense of like real personal autonomy that a good open world game can give you. But you give that up to have this very, crafted adventure with a lot of set pieces and scripted moments. And then in between the two, I think is kind of what we're starting to see more of, which I kind of feel is necessary. And it's interesting as we're talking about this, and that Final Fantasy VI really just kind of divvied up its game in both halves, almost to explore both sides of that coin.
Yeah.
Almost as a response to what we're now, 20 plus years later, talking about as a problem with open world games. Like it almost seems like a premonition. Like Final Fantasy VI was like, someday there'll be open world games, so let us show you both. Because the first half of the game is much more on rails. And then, like you
Mhm.
mentioned, you get to World of Ruin, and then all of a sudden, what do you do? And that's
Mhm.
often one of the big complaints about the game. Like I know a lot of people that love the first half of the game, and then don't like the second half.
Yeah.
So what is it about Final Fantasy VI that kept you coming back? Is it the open world component? Is it more the charm? Is it the battle system or the pacing or something a little bit different, or a little bit all of that?
It's a good question. You know, I think for me, it's changed over time because I've grown up with that game. Like the first time I played it when it came out in 1994, I was 13 years old. I was an impressionable teenager. You know, I had enough understanding of the world and, of course, reading comprehension and things like that. I have a lit degree. I've always been an avid reader. Um, but it was when I was 13, you know, growing up queer in an evangelical household, in an evangelical community, I always felt like an outsider. And so originally, what really got me about Final Fantasy VI wasn't even the gameplay, it was the story. It was Terra's quest to find her place in the world, always feeling like an outsider, never feeling like she could experience or know what love is because there was no way for her to really relate with any one other person in her life up to that point. And her life up to
Mm-hmm.
that point was controlled. I had so many parallels with Tara growing up. And so that's what really grasped me when I was an adolescent
That's
with the game.
that's interesting. I've never quite thought about it in those terms. And that Tara, for example, she is born out of something that's natural,
Mhm.
but it's just not what society has ever seen before.
Yeah.
Because she's this kind of half breed, this half
Mhm.
Esper, half human, and she looks like a human, acts like a human that's figuring out how to be a human,
Yeah.
and most of the world is either scared of her or distrusting, or they want to control her.
Yeah.
And I can imagine growing up, uh, being gay, but not maybe necessarily having come to a point of total like, yes, this is
Yeah.
me, or is this wrong, or what am I? All of those feelings probably make one feel pretty alien. And
Mhm.
then the entire time, much like Tara, you're trying to act normal in the way that society wants you to
Right.
act, and it doesn't always work. And then in the meantime, you have a lot of people, like perhaps a church, that wants to control you and tell you
Mhm.
how you should act and
The
how you should
Empire.
think. The empire. Yeah, and hopefully somewhere along the way you find some friends that accept you for what you are, and you can grow from there.
Yeah. That's really what grabbed me at first. I mean, I had played through Secret of Mana the year before when it came out in 1993, and I remember really enjoying that and knowing that Final Fantasy was a Square soft series. So
Yeah.
when six came out, I was very interested to play it just because I was familiar with, Secret of Mana and I loved that. Six was the first turn-based RPG that really turned me on, and it was because I had such resonance with the story and the characters and what was going on with it. I had tried to play turn-based games in the past. I tried to play Final Fantasy 2/4 prior to
Mm-hmm.
six. I couldn't get into it. Of course, Dragon Warrior or Quest one, I
Yep.
got it free with my Nintendo Power subscription back in like what 1989.
Yeah.
I couldn't get into it. There was just no way for me to get into that. It was just so boring.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now I love Dragon Quest one because I'm like, I totally get RPGs now, and I love just sitting there in a grind, and that's all you do in that game is grind. That's it. But it's
Yeah.
mindless, and I can appreciate that now. But as a kid, I couldn't. But it was really the story that resonated with me, and then. But I remember beating it, and I beat it very much like I think you probably recently played through it. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't understand the concept of grinding, so I just went from story beat to story beat to story beat and got my ass kicked over and over and over again. But I beat that fucking game with every single character. And I did it way underpowered than I would ever play through that game nowadays.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I know how to play the game. I played it so many times to enjoy the story that I have gone back and now I understand the grind. I understand the grind spots. I understand what I need to do in order to get the spells that I need to get. I understand how all the espers not only affect the magic that you have available at all, but also affects your stats.
Yeah, and how you're
on level
leveling.
up for certain things. So and how to really craft your characters. And that's the other thing that I love and ended up loving about that game as an adult, is that on top of having the world of Ruin being that open world experience, which I do like that portion of the game better than the linear experience in the World of Balance these days. The other thing I like is that every character, kind of like Final Fantasy 12, they have their base stats where they're going to be, you know, a little bit better in magic or a little bit better in this, but then you can mold the characters into whatever the hell you want them to be.
Yeah.
On top
Yeah.
of having their job, you can still, if you want to, you can pump a bunch of like magic buffs into Sabin and actually make him a pretty decent magic user. Is he ever going to be quite as good as Terra or Realm? No. Can you get him to be as good as Celeste? Yeah, probably. You know, I mean, it just really depends on what you do and how you stack your characters and how much time you want to invest in doing what you want to with the game. It's so
Yeah.
open-ended.
Yeah, and the fact that any of the espers can allow a character to learn pretty much any spell in the book.
Yep.
Which is all interesting too, because this isn't made very explicit when you play through the game. Like it's only through repeat playthroughs. Like I had no idea that the espers themselves affected how different stats were being leveled up the first time I played through. I just kind of leaned forward, you know, through it all.
Yep.
And there's also, of course, a lot of legacy Final Fantasy knowledge into how the world works that's baked in there for you to take advantage of. You know, for instance, using the Phoenix down on an undead behemoth to instantly kill them or something along those
using
lines.
cure on undead and stuff like that.
Yeah. And I think also what ends up happening, at least through a first playthrough, is that you tend to probably pick up the kind of gear and you optimize, aka, you know, hit the button to automatically just put the best stuff on your characters. And you probably don't think too much about, okay, this weapon, you know, maybe does fire damage and this shield will absorb lightning. And you start to kind of mix and match and craft your party as you go into a fight. And that's that extra level that I think is also not explicitly explained. And you're never backed into a corner where you have to do it, but it sure is satisfying if you actually spend the time to think about the gear and put a little bit of strategy into it.
Right. Yeah. 100%. I mean, God, there's so many very strong weapons in the game that like Locke, Terra, Celis can all use. But typically I have those characters in the back row. And those weapons, I mean, if I actually use just attack in a battle, those weapons aren't going to do much from the back row. So if I press optimize, the game's going to give them the best stat weapon, but I don't want that. I want the weapon that does the same damage from the back row. Or like with Locke, once I get the Brigand's Glove, where it changes steel to mug. And he steals, and then he attacks. Well, then I'll give him the best weapon for him, because it doesn't matter if he's in the back line or not. I'm always going to use mug because it's always going to hit.
Yeah. And it's also interesting too to see some of the like overpowered kind of stuff that you can stack in that game. Like when you get like the Master Scroll and then you stack it with like a Genji glove. And so you have like somebody dual wielding. With quick. And then all of a sudden they're doing like 4 sets of double attacks and hitting something 8 times, which is just ridiculous looking, but so fun to put it together. And it's one of those things too that I think has been a constant in Final Fantasy games. Like they kind of want you to poke around and figure out how to make your characters a bit overpowered and how to really game it. Like I remember playing through Final Fantasy X for the first time way back, and my Titus by the end of the game had like auto haste and then like 3 other hastes that would stack, and he would basically get like 8 turns before anybody else. And there's
he's just really fast speed stat anyway.
But there's like a certain kind of gleeful feeling that comes from bending a game to your will like that, and to see what you can get out of it kind of reminds me of
Final Fantasy 12 for me. Oh God, by the end of that game, like every character would cast haste, would cast bubble, which like gives you like triple HP or double HP or something ridiculous.
I forgot about that.
All these buffs, and then I just go in and and just everything's just set on these gambits, and I'm like, This is satisfying. This is my coding handiwork right here.
See, and that's this kind of separation, at least that I feel personally, and that when I play an old school JRPG like 6, I really enjoy the battle system. And I've been thinking about this a lot. Like, what is it that really I just enjoy so much? And I think part of it is its presentation. I love that it's cute. I love that everything is kind of diminished and small. And there's an element of just like overlooking my entire party in the situation. And I feel like I'm creating this little sequence that I let loose.
Yeah.
And I think that's a core tenet of JRPGs that's often not talked about, is that when you create something that's turn-based, there's an element of kind of locking and loading your moves. And then the battle system takes over. And, you know, as their different times come up, boom, they go out. And what ends up happening is you start mentally mapping what's going to happen, almost as if you were playing chess, where you're like, okay, I've got these light enemies here. So I'm going to have my first character cast, you know, Fyra, and it's going to hit, you know, across the board, all of them. And I know it's going to hit enough to take out the light ones. So my next character, I'm not even going to worry about the light ones. They're now focusing on the big guy. And like, you get to tune it too, because, you know, maybe that doesn't work out. Maybe you realize, oh, these little guys are going to cast shell. So I got to actually target them first. But what ends up happening is that you come up with these little strategic answers to whatever the battle is. And, you know, with a little bit of practice, you almost create an internal language for how that's going to look, whether that be like, you know, wide attack with a focus and a little bit of defense. And then maybe I'm healing up or preemptively, you know, casting something to make sure that I can dodge that one big physical attack that's going to, you know, touch of death me and so forth. And like, I really enjoy that. I enjoy that feeling of sorting things out and even being efficient too. Because that goes hand in hand with the process of exploring a dungeon, the actual crawling through the dungeon, where we get the verb crawl. There's a reason why they don't call it a dungeon walk or a dungeon sprint. It's a slow process, and you're dealing with RNG as these battles come up, and you want to be efficient. And there's this risk reward of how far do you keep pushing before you're gonna, you know, run out of MP and be in a bad situation. You don't want to die and lose your work. So, you know, maybe you pull it back to your save spot, and then you make another push out and another push out. And there's that almost a Jacques Cousteau feeling of like, okay, another dive into the depths. We're going to go a little further analogy. This time, a little further, and eventually hit that boss, you know, and then you go for it. And there's a lot on the line because it's, you know, that distance you traveled to get there. That kind of balance, though, to me, that's the quintessential elements of like a JRPG. That's what resonates for me. And I feel like that's also what I struggle with in a lot of the more modern Final Fantasies. I really appreciate that they are still keeping the Final Fantasy like elements in the game, and there's constant nods back to the series, constant, and the feeling is there. But the battle systems have now moved on to a place where they're much more focused on being real time, very big, very flashy. And that sense that I was just describing of being tactical about the battles and setting them up and then letting them rip, I never get that feeling anymore. And I think that's partially why I've been kind of bouncing off of them. That said, I mean, I did finish 15, but I'm secretly kind of waiting for them to return to those roots. I don't know if it'll ever happen though. I think it's almost relegated to their side series at this point.
Yeah, I think so. You say that, and we should maybe like have this discussion offline. I'll get into the nitty gritty of it probably with you offline, because I don't want to like throw this idea out there for the world to steal from me. But I've had this idea for a variation on Final Fantasy VI's battle system for what like a modern remake might look like, that would do more to keep the game in line with what it used to be, rather than say what Square did with the Final Fantasy VII remake was, oh, now it's an action RPG. Sure, there's some menus and stuff you can go through, but it's
Yeah.
still an action RPG, right? It's an action RPG in the same vein of Final Fantasy 15 is now an action RPG. And there's
Mhm.
room for that. And I enjoy both battle systems in both of those games. I enjoyed both of those games very much, except for the end of 15 or a 7 remake, which was dumb.
Oh yeah, yeah. It kind of went
Especially
off in
that
a
dumb
different
dog
direction.
battle. Anyway, but it's my thought process is, and I'll go down with you some of my design ideas later, but kind
Why
of
not now?
taking,
Are you worried that somebody will like take your
yeah,
idea and run
totally,
with it?
yeah, totally. I don't want to do that.
But I mean,
The crux of it is this: take the idea of Final Fantasy VI, but then add a little bit of the battle system from the Grandia games.
okay,
So did you ever play Grandia 2
like
all that much
five,
on the
6 hours.
Dreamcast? Okay.
Yeah.
So the battle system in both Grandia games, well, the first two, I can't remember the third one. I didn't play it all that much. It's turn-based, but then you also have an action bar at the bottom, and the characters will actually move around the screen.
Oh, that's right.
The Lunar games are also kind of like that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so instead of having an active time gauge for each individual character like a traditional Final Fantasy game, you have this movement bar that shows where each individual enemy and player character is on that bar, and when they're going to like hit this, like, I don't know, activation point. And then they still have just a little bit to go. So say if you need to cast a magic attack, you hit that bar and all of a sudden your item wheel comes up, and you can pick to do your normal combo attack, which is like your normal attack. You can do a critical attack, which can cancel the move of a opponent. So say if they're charging up a magic attack and you do your critical attack, it'll actually cancel it and push them down to the end of the action bar, and they have to start their turn all over again. Like they lose their turn.
Yeah,
It's
that's
really
cool.
cool.
Right there, it adds a whole nother dimension to the tactics.
But then it goes even further because you have things moving around everywhere. So say if your enemy is over here and you're over here, let me put my hands on the screen. Say the enemy's over here and you're over here, right? And you do an attack like your combo attack, which means you have to run up to this enemy. If there's other enemies in the way, you have to run around them, but it's all automated and you can only run so much. And if you can't reach the enemy, you're done, and you are fatigued and you lost that turn. But same as you can cancel enemies' attacks, enemies can cancel your attacks as well. So you're constantly playing with this idea of space, even though you can't actually control the movement around that space. You're dealing with the idea of space on top of kind of an active time system where you can actually throw the opponent out of whatever attack that they're planning. It's fantastic fun. It's a great battle system. As I revisited Grandia 2 last year, I just ate it up. I just was loving that battle system again. I forgot how good it was.
Yeah, just one sec. I'll be right back.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love that idea that it adds this extra layer to start opening things up. And I feel like that's kind of what has been taken to the extreme with action RPGs, where they're like, okay, we need something more dazzling, something quicker, something to really attract people that just want to pick up and play, but we can still bring the RPG elements to them. Like almost there's that certain feeling that like I almost interpret it as like the kids these days have low attention spans, so we gotta razzle dazzle them, and then we'll sneak the vegetables in. When I would love if we just continually innovated on the core concepts of a JRPG, of those turn-based elements, and like, yeah, that's a perfect example where Grandia 2 did. Grandia the first one also do that, or is it just the second?
Grandia 1 also did that. I would say Grandia 2 was more elegant.
Yeah. And so it adds this extra dimension of now, you have movement and you have time that also has to be calculated in. And some of the later Final Fantasy games did that a little bit more with like the active time battle systems playing a bigger part. But yeah, they never really got into movement. And
Mm.
I found myself thinking about this the other day, and I was having a hard time thinking of JRPGs that really added those extra levels to the cake, so to say. Like a lot of what was added often felt kind of gimmicky to me. Like, do you remember that one? I think it was a PS2 JRPG called Shadow Hearts or something
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah.
And every time you would attack, it would have like a roulette wheel kind of thing.
Hmm. Oh yeah,
Um,
God, I remember that. Yeah.
See, I kind of have the same response to that, where I'm like, uh, like it just feels like this clunky thing that was like tacked on without really adding anything.
Hmm.
If anything, like a, a slot machine's not really what I'm looking for, you know? Maybe, I mean, it's an okay mechanic if you want to do it every once in a while, like a Setzer kind of approach or something, but for an entire game, like, no thanks. Um, I applaud you for trying,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I wanted to see more of that, you know? And I think one of the biggest innovations that probably doesn't get a whole lot of credit, well, maybe it does, is Super Mario RPG.
Hmm.
To me, that was the first time that I ever experienced an RPG that had little bits of action game qualities peppered
Hmm.
in there. It was kind of in the vein of a real, what do you call it, a quick time event
Hmm.
before that was ever even a thing.
Yeah.
And I thought that worked really well because all of a sudden the mindless grind becomes a little bit more intentional. You're paying attention more. It's
Hmm.
satisfying, and it gives you a little bit more to think about and work with. Um, and then they created they kept going with that series, which is cool. Uh, but I found myself kind of at a loss. Like there was this big gap where I was like, what other games were doing innovative stuff? And I'm sure there's plenty that were.
Yeah.
I'm not the biggest JRPG guy, but I
There's
just
been a
found
few.
myself kind of in this big gulf of nothing until for me, it was Undertale. That was probably
Mhm.
one of the most innovative. I guess you could call it a JRPG. It certainly has a lot of that styling, very Earthbound notes to it.
Mhm.
But the battle system, holy cow, that goes in some really cool places. Um, Now I know you haven't played through that one yet. Hopefully someday. I think
I'll get there. I'll get there.
that would be a good like homework and book report for class podcast kind of game.
Okay. Okay. Fair. I need to do that in
Yeah,
Zero Gunner. All right. Go on. Go on.
yeah. It's like probably I want to say like 20 hours, something like that.
I probably would say even less than that, but yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic game. You're going to start it and you're going to be like, these graphics are terrible.
Oh, that doesn't bother me.
It has the feel of like, I don't know, a really underbaked indie game, honestly.
It looks like an
Um,
underbaked Earthbound.
yeah, yeah, it does. Like it's still gooey on the inside and not a good way.
Yeah.
But yeah, give it like an hour and all of a sudden it's going to start doing things that were way different. It does a lot of self-aware elements of what you would typically expect from an RPG, and becomes really whimsical and playful about it. And for instance, you can do an entire pacifist run of the game. You don't have to kill a single person.
Yeah.
You can basically just make peace with everybody all the way down the line. And it's usually a harder route, but there's some cool payoffs to it.
Mhm.
What's really neat though is you have a relatively typical battle system with HP and I think MP and stuff, and you have healing potions or whatever the equivalent is. The cool thing though is that when you actually defend against the enemy, it's brings up this little square in the middle of the screen, and you have your little guy, which I believe is like a little red heart. And all of a sudden, it takes like bullet hell and like shmup elements
Mhm.
and introduces it into the game. And like maybe you just have to, avoid the musical notes as this
Yeah.
evil boombox is
Okay.
attacking you.
I think
But
I've
like,
seen that in a video or
yeah,
something. Yeah.
but oh my God, does it do well? It pays such good justice to the concept. And by the end of the game, it is just blowing it out of the water and like opening up that mechanic and turning it into things that you'd never believe. It
Very
has one
cool.
of the coolest, craziest final bosses. And it's purely this mix of JRPG with like shmup mechanics, and it works. It works really, really well. And it's gotten me thinking, like why does this work? How does this work?
Hmm.
And where else could JRPGs go? So I don't know if that's something you thought about much. Like what would be that innovation? If a new JRPG, you know, of that classic turn-based ish style came out, like where would you like the battle system to go? What would you like to see?
I mean, you were asking me the other day, kind of thinking about stuff for this, to reach out to one of my buddies and think about, like, what are some classic JRPGs where there was just something else that the developer tried to put in the battle system to make it more interesting or to give it a little bit more interactivity.
Yeah.
And some of the ones like we came up with were like Final Fantasy VIII. So you have the gun blade. So press R2 or whatever the moment it strikes, and you get an extra like
That's right.
burst with that. Okay,
Yeah.
whatever. You still end up using Guardian Forces or the
Yeah.
summons every battle anyway. Um,
And the leeching mechanic too, right? Where you had to absorb magic
yeah,
to then
dude, absorb
use
magic
it.
out of spots. Yeah,
Yeah.
don't get me started on Final Fantasy VIII. I'm never gonna like that game.
Yeah.
Um, there was also Lost Odyssey on the 360 that had a similar mechanic where like you got this like circle or something and it comes in and you got to press the button and then it does more damage or something else.
Right. I
So it's
forgot about
like,
that. Yeah.
but it's all an iteration on what you already said that
Mhm.
Mario RPG did. Like
Yep.
with Mario, you jump on the enemy and then you press the button. You can continue to jump on them for quite a few times as long as you get that timing down. So
Yeah.
it was all kind of iterating on that. And honestly, I just, as I look at different JRPGs that have been out there, like you had Final Fantasy 12, which was very different. It doesn't have it's not an action RPG, nor is it a turn-based RPG. It is a
Mhm.
programmable MMO.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's nothing else like it. Nothing
Right.
in this
So
world.
interesting. Yeah.
So I mean that kind of stands alone. You have similar games, kind of like Xenoblade Chronicles, which kind of play more like an MMO, where all the actions are you kind of control what's going on, but everything's automatic, but you can influence what's going on during the
Mhm.
battles. That's another approach. What I'm really looking forward to, and the name is escaping me right now, but the RPG being developed by Sabotage, so the makers of the Messenger.
Oh,
And if there's one developer that is going to be able to take an old idea and inject it with new
yeah.
shit, but still make it feel like a classic, it's them.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so fond of the messenger.
I'm playing it through again right now. I can't get enough
Yeah.
of it. I
I
play it through
for
every couple years now. I just love that game.
Oh man, I forgot they released that trailer for that
Yeah.
16-bit looking RPG that they were working on.
And the
Yeah.
crowdfunding just ended for it, and they met all their stretch goals. So there's going to be all sorts of cool shit for it. But yeah, I mean,
Cool.
and it looks awesome, and it's set in the same universe as the Messenger as well, which is
Oh,
also
it is.
yeah.
Nice.
And I hope they have the same writer.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, the shopkeeper was so good. So good.
All
So
the
that was
stories.
some of the best writing. Yeah.
I hope they have some stories in there for us to listen to that have nothing to do with the plot.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, if there's one developer that I think can really take that to the next level, it's probably going to be them. I'm actually looking for some really cool stuff. There's another one. So thinking about to the Suikoden games, I'm a huge fan of the Suikoden series.
Yeah.
And they had the injection of the different types of like large strategy battles you could have in the
Oh,
games.
that's right. Yeah. I
But
remember those.
also in the, smaller turn-based battles, typically it was 6 people or
Mhm.
6 characters. And then you have, different combo attacks per 2 or 3, sometimes 4 characters, depending on the relationships and your team composition and stuff like that, which was really cool. And the last mainline one, Suikoden 5, didn't really iterate on the formula that much, but there's another game coming out, another indie title that takes the Suikoden template to the next level as well.
Cool.
I'm looking forward to. And again, the name
Yeah.
escapes me. I should have Steam up on my other screen, but I don't. But anyway.
Yeah. It rings a bell as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Eludian Chronicles, I think, something like that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
But it looks really cool. So I'm looking for them to do something interesting as a spin on the Suikoden setup, because that's what it's kind
Yeah.
of aping.
And how interesting that our like beacons of innovation now are pretty firmly on the indie scene.
They're the only ones that can take the financial risk to innovate.
Yeah, yeah.
And kind of like back in the day, it's kind of the same kind of philosophy.
Yeah,
Small teams of 15 to 20 people that are able to innovate because they're not putting, millions of dollars into marketing and millions of
yeah,
dollars into their graphics. And.
yeah. It's kind of the food truck approach to things. Could try out that new Asian Mexican fusion or whatever without having to invest
Dude,
into a lease for a brick and
yeah.
mortar restaurant, you know?
That's a really great analogy. Like everything in our society today, I'm not going to say everything, I'm being too general, but many things in our society today, like so many things just feel like a copy of a copy of a copy because
Hmm.
innovation in today's world is so expensive. And
Yeah,
so the best food you can get are in the food trucks.
yeah,
Some of the best games, really the best well-designed games you're going to play these days, probably indie games. Some of the best
yeah.
music out there, the shit that's not played on the radio that you're going to have to dig through YouTube to find.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and it's this interesting double-edged sword too, because a lot of people, what I'm seeing as I'm getting more into creating an indie game, is there's a lot of people that are just cynical and burnt out, in the sense of like, oh, the time to make an indie game is long gone. The golden age was 2012, and anymore, the market is overly saturated. But that just strikes me as overt cynicism.
The market is oversaturated, but there's always been too many video games for the amount of people playing video games. Even in the
Yeah,
80s and 90s when there wasn't, 25 games
right,
coming out every day,
right.
there's still too many video games for people to play, right? There's
Yeah,
always been that problem.
and I think people, yeah, they forget that if you went back, 20 years to you know, dollar video store, Hollywood Video or something, you would just see piles of shitty shovelware. Certainly there's more
Yeah.
than ever, but uh it's always been there. It's
It's always
always
been
been
there.
there.
It's always been there.
Yeah, yeah. If you focus and you make something really good, and your heart is in the right place and you're interested in like just chipping away and failing forward, like I feel like it'll totally be worth it. But again, I mean, if you're trying to make games, and you're not into geeking out over the mechanics of games in the first
Yeah.
place, like, well, you're probably just going to end up making shovelware.
Right.
So go be part of the problem, I guess. I don't know, but it doesn't affect me one bit. Um, I'm firmly on the side of interested in like where these mechanics can go, because I feel like they're far from dried up. If anything, I think that they're kind of underexplored. But I love that people are still doing stuff with them. I think as like an interesting exercise, I like to think of almost the verb of a game. For Mario, that verb is jump. Um,
Sure.
and to think about the kinetic qualities that really like sell the game, again, Mario, him running and sliding a little bit like that's one of those very particular little kinetic qualities.
Yeah.
And I think those all contribute to game feel, and that's partly why I have such a sweet spot for JRPGs, is that they were limited with the amount of sprites that they could work with and the animation itself. So they had to really sell the hits with this kind of classic kinetic qualities.
Right. Right.
And I think it came through in the mechanics, it came through in the animation, and all of the juicy elements like the sounds and whatnot. But I would love to see more of that leaned into it. Like we were talking about, for instance, with JRPG, the old Final Fantasy games give you a lock and then load and shoot kind of
Yeah.
quality to your actions. Like, what if we just really leaned into that, so that when you tell somebody to line up an attack, he doesn't just wait patiently until he does the attack. What if it really was, I don't know, something equivalent of like pulling back into a catapult and then
Yeah.
letting your little warrior go plow through a line of enemies,
Right.
or the same thing with a spell, being able to almost play like little mini games with like where the spell is hitting and what it's occupying, but to further double down on the verb of the spell. Like I was also thinking just really like far left field, like what is something that's never been done? And I've been working on and playing like shmups a lot lately. Like, what about this? This is just total spitballing here. But what if it was an RPG where you get into a fight and then there's different patterns of enemies that come through? So maybe there's like the sine wave kind of element of enemies. Maybe another one's like kind of a spread bloom as they come across, or whatever. And your job is to take your 3 little fighter ships. And they all have different ways of shooting. One of them shoots like a fine line. Another maybe just does like an up close like attack that's short range. But you have to place them, so that they actually intercept the sine wave of the enemies as they're coming around, or like the enemies that are coming from the corner. So you angle somebody to make sure that takes care of all of them, and then you can deal your damage elsewhere. Almost like little mini moments of tower defense, as if you were positioning ships in a shoot 'em up.
You can do that a little bit in the Grandia games. So say like, because typically in the Grandia games, you have swarms of enemies, right?
Okay.
And all of your magic attacks will either go in a straight line. So any enemies in that line will get hit by your magic attack, or large area magic attacks, or really channeling a single enemy. So say you have like a group of 3 enemies over here and maybe just 2 that are over here a little bit away. You have one person focus a magic attack on a group over here, while the other 2 characters in your party can focus on the other 2 that are over here. So you have one person taking care of this flank and the other 2 people taking care of the others that are in this flank. Kind of that idea.
Cool. Yeah. I like that. It almost makes me think of like bowling, like that element of like lining up a straight shot as you're throwing it across. Yeah, all of these kind of elements and what we can do with them. I just would love to see more of. I still feel like it's just kind of undertapped, and instead the RPG market has almost abandoned it, and instead said, "Oh, everything should just be, an action RPG."
Yeah.
Which is, again, it's cool, but I don't know. By the time I got to the end of the Final Fantasy VII remake, like I was done with all the action RPG elements. I was kind of done with the game. Like
same.
A lot of the charm and everything wore off, and I was left with a very pretty coat of paint with a very boring personality.
Yeah.
Even as crazy as it was still showing me, all these new characters and whatnot, like I just fell off the cart like halfway through. And I think part of that is because it wasn't really grounded in some super, to me, fun game mechanics. Instead, it was just flashy, bombastic mechanics,
Yeah. Going back to a idea that you said just a little bit ago, like, Mario's key verb is jump, right? And I really enjoy games, especially fighting games. I'm not going to get on that tangent right now, but I love games that have simplicity. I like things that are easy to understand and hard to master. Things that are really satisfying to master, but have mechanics or ideas that are immediately understandable and accessible to most people. And, thinking about game design, I'm always thinking about game design. And I think that's a good philosophy to go into games with. So what is the key verb for this game that I want to create? What is the main thing that this person is going to be doing, or the player is going to be doing as they interact with my piece of art? With Mario, it's jumping, right? The art of jumping is Mario. Even in modern 3D or 2D Mario games, all of Mario's movesets are something to do with him jumping. It's always something with jumping. With Mega Man, you add a verb, but it's still the same thing. It's jump and shoot. How can you jump and shoot? And so Mega Man is probably the best example of jump and shoot because of how scripted everything is. And I love that scriptedness, because as you continue to get better at jumping and shooting, you get better at enemy placement, knowing where things are, and you can end up blowing through the game without even getting hit. And people that, watch you playing are like, how did you know that enemy was going to be there? Well, because I played this game 500 times and I know that enemy is going to be there. So I can shoot and it's going to hit the enemy the second the enemy appears on the screen, right? There's just a great feeling with that as a player. So as I'm thinking about, like fighting games, punch the guy in the face or punching, whatever. What would that verb be for maybe classic Final Fantasy. And then maybe we could do an idea of, okay, well, think about, different types of JRPGs. What is that verb that pulls through the main gameplay crux? And then how can we evolve those verbs into something interesting that we could make today?
Yeah, that's a great brainstorming topic, basically. Yeah, yeah, because it could go in so many different directions. I feel like the answer to that would change depending on who you talked to and why they played Final Fantasy. You might talk to somebody who is really into the game mechanics and not so much into the story, and they would say, maybe the verb is like level up, like it all is leading up to that little moment of boop, and the fanfare plays,
right,
and you get a little bit stronger, and like that's the core, working up the ladder of a Final Fantasy game. Whereas somebody else is more into the story, they might say, it is something more like revenge, or or just explore, crawl dungeon.
God, that's Metroid's verb, explore.
Yeah.
There's a lot of other elements to the game, but the key element of Metroid is to explore, find shit.
Yeah. And I think this approach to it, I think this is such a grand way to make a game, and to think about games, honestly, because a really good game will know that about itself, and will build around that. I think that's often what happens, or doesn't happen, when you get a game that just kind of ends up being like a 6 out of 10 for you. There's usually that sense of oh, it does a lot of really good things, but it just doesn't all come together. And you're left with this kind of that you can't quite put your finger on it.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times it's exactly what you said. It's that the game, they didn't do that brainstorming. They weren't aware of what their core verbs were, what the roots of their language were. And it comes through. The player's then left with a wishy-washy feeling when the game is, wishy-washy.
I'm constantly thinking about that kind of stuff because as a learning and development professional, as an adult educator, everything that I do is driven by my learning objectives.
Yeah.
I never want anybody to understand something. I want people to explore a concept. I want people to interact with a concept in some meaningful way. So when I'm designing a learning program, whether it's something that a workshop that people come to, or right now, I am redesigning a global organization's L&D function, I have a core set of action verbs that that are my guiding principles. And it's not like 20 things, you might learn more, but there's, 3 or 4 very specific action verbs. Now there's a whole objective that I make out of those verbs, but I could take those 3 or 4 verbs by themselves, and that is my driving force behind how I'm designing what I'm designing. And if I don't have those verbs, everything falls apart, right? I don't have anything to pull it back to. When I hit that writer's block, or that block on developing whatever course or class or program it is, I can go back to my verb. I'm like, okay, so what is my aim again? What am I trying to do? What am I trying to get the person to engage with?
Yeah,
that kind of thing. And it helps to answer that question as you get stuck. And I don't know enough about being in corporate game design to be like, maybe they already do that. I don't know. All I know is interviews I read and things like that. I haven't been privy to those meetings, but it makes me wonder. To you said, those games, especially RPGs, where I often will play a little bit, I'll think it's cool, then I just completely fall off, and I'm like, what verb am I missing? What verb did they miss? Where it's not hitting me. It's hitting other people and they're finishing it. But then is that sunk cost bias? Are they finishing it just because they bought the game? I don't know what it is,
Yeah. It's the other tangent is probably saved for another conversation, but I was just talking with a guy that I used to work with in learning and development, and we hadn't talked in a while. We were just video chatting, and he's building out some new stuff for New Relic. And he's going through all of the normal kind of steps of laying out a program and whatnot. And we were talking about how interesting it is that like we feel so confident about what works in terms of education, and we spent so much time reading books and attending seminars and trying out different stuff. And we're, you know, in an L&D role, you're paid to be an expert on how all of this works.
Yeah.
Yet at the same time, education as we know it, people going to a school, has only existed for like a few hundred years. Like it's very nascent. It doesn't really go that far back.
Right.
Pretty soon you hit a point where it's just like, oh, okay, we've only actually been documenting this for a tiny thumbnail of human history, yet we've been educating, teaching, and learning the entire way through. And his kind of take on it was like, yeah, we can try different stuff, and you know, we can present things in a PowerPoint that makes us, you know, we're gonna put these objectives and these are all going to connect and stuff. He's like, but underneath it, there's like an element of like humans that already know how to learn. They know how to do the thing. Where things often go astray is where we're just lacking some of the direction and some of those little like keystones at the heart of it. And that those are actually far more important, whether it be identifying core verbs that everything is built on. Like, and his kind of argument was, as long as you do that, go to town with the rest. Honestly, you could write out your objectives, you know, 30 different ways. None of that will matter if those core verbs are off. And also none of that will matter as long as those core verbs are so on that they'll drive the natural learning either way. But of course, the beautiful thing is as long as you can nail those, you can start to experiment, and then you can test it, and then you can measure it, and then we can start to be scientific about the efficacy. We are not talking about Final Fantasy anymore, though. We are now on a whole nother side.
I'm still going to take that further, because I'm going to pull it back to Zelda, which you can say Zelda's an action RPG. All right, it's still on course. You take some of the criticism that Nintendo has had over the last 20 years, especially with Zelda titles, of them constantly holding your hand and thinking that the player is an absolute idiot and isn't going to understand exactly what's in front of their face. And then Breath of the Wild comes out.
Boom.
There's no direction. You don't know what the fuck you're supposed to be doing. There's 2 hours of direction at the beginning, and it's like, all right, tackle the world. You can do whatever you want. Then you do whatever you want. Elden Ring, very similar setup. Just after the first hour or two, tackle the world. Do whatever the hell you want to do. And you know what? People respond to that because people know how to learn. We're a curious species, right? We have the cognitive ability to figure things out. So trust us. Trust us to figure things out. We might need a little hint here or there, but we don't need, as Ego Raptor said, Mega Man, you know, dropping up every 5 seconds. You do this, do this, do this. I don't need to know that, right? And the game doesn't always have to teach you everything either. Like, you don't always need an iterative process to see what's going on. You can just learn just by exploring and doing and testing stuff out yourself. You don't need those scripted moments either, as you know, trying to traditional game design would tell you.
It's almost as if we forgot that the verb of play is a inherently curious, probing, fun-loving little verb. Play creates knowledge. Play is educational. It's only when you strip it away and present all of the education on fine rails so that nothing gets missed, then play actually isn't educational anymore. Play is just observant. You're hoping for education. And gosh, that's just not nearly as interesting, engaging, or fun. I love that we now have something like Breath of Wild that came out and hopefully kind of changed up people's kind of paradigm of game design, and got them to think more about, as you said, trusting the player. I feel like that is probably at the heart of every great game.
Mhm. People respond best, and this isn't just me talking out of my ass. The people respond best when they're trusted.
Yes.
Whether it is with game design like that, or even like at my new office, like there's these little convenience stores that are set up and there's no clerk there. There's no one there. And it's a literal like full convenience store on our fourth floor. And there's a little kiosk and you pick up the thing and you go to the kiosk and you pay for it, but there's no one there. It's on the honor system.
Yeah.
But they've never had a problem with theft. Well, why? Well, in a setting like that, no one wants to be that guy. But also, it feels good because it's like, oh, they're trusting me to do this.
Yeah.
Same with our cafeteria. You get your food. There's no one by all of the checkout stations. They trust that you are going to do what you should do, right?
Nice.
And it makes you feel good as an employee in that setting. And something like Breath of the Wild, and I think Elden Ring is probably the most recent example. And it took 5 years to get from Breath of the Wild to Elden Ring. So let that sink in. Like what Breath of the Wild did for video games, it took another developer 5 years to get the formula just right, where they didn't need to handhold or didn't feel like they needed to handhold, right? For a big complex game like that. It took 5 years for one other developer to get that. So how long is it going to take for other developers to really follow suit and really think about how we can expand the idea of the traditional JRPG?
Yeah.
Without all that exposition that you don't really need.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, my friend, that might actually be a good stopping point on a really good point in itself. I know.
And there's a question for everybody. So give us your thoughts in the comments.
Yes. Yes. Talk to us. I know we originally thought we were like, let's do a more concentrated, just maybe a 20-minute episode. And that we would cut out all of the what are you playing lately and all of that. And yeah, it turns out we still talked now very focused for an hour. So
we could went on.
Oh, I know. Either way, good conversation. It's good to be recording a bit after a break as well.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll be back with a little bit more cadence. And I've got some other stuff that I'm hoping to do. I've been going through interviews and stuff for the last couple months, and that was taking all of my free time, non-game time, but all of my extra free time that I had. So yeah, we'll be back with more content a little bit more frequently. So all of you that have stuck around, thank you. You all are fantastic. Thanks for following and all the cool likes on my game tour video. That was a lot of fun.
Yes. Yeah. All right. Till next time.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.
Adios.